Hi everyone and welcome to another review by ThinkerThemer. I'm Amy, this is my fiance Maggie. Together we review games from two different perspectives, myself from the mechanics of the game and Maggie is all about the theme or the story of the game. Today we are really excited to be reviewing Tapestry by Jamie Stegmaier of Stonemaier Games, who has kindly provided this review copy to us, but as always we will be very truthful about all of our experiences of this game.
Yeah. So in Tapestry, we are all going to be building our own unique civilization. And so we're going to be moving ourselves from the way of the earlier stages of being able to make fire all the way through to potentially exploring the outer space. The way we're going to be doing that is through a combination of exploring technologies, doing scientific advancements, exploring land, and then conquering territories along the way.
Now this game is really all about the 4 tracks on the board: the science track, exploration track, technology track, and military track. And all you're going to be doing on your turn is moving your color player piece up one of those tracks. That's it. That is all you do. And you have to pay some resources that escalate in cost as you move further along each of these tracks. And then the space that you land on is going to provide you with some kind of action. And the action that it provides you with depends on which of these tracks you are going along. For example, the technology track, as you move up this track, you are going to be able to draft these technologies from the central pool, bring them into your player area, and as you upgrade them, it's going to give you extra resources, different benefits in the game, sometimes just a whole heap of victory points. However, if you choose to move up the science track lays the foundation for movement along the other tracks. So the science track actually allows you to often roll this dice, and this dice has all of the other tracks featured on it. And whatever you roll, you're going to be able to move yourself on one of these other tracks, thereby eliminating essentially the need to take a turn or to pay resources to do so. Now, the exploration track is all about these terrain tiles. Either it will allow you to collect them or allow you to play them out into the central part of the board, which gives you victory points, but also one-off resource or benefit bonuses from playing that tile. And finally, the military track is going to allow you to conquer those tiles. So you will be able to move along, placing out your player color in this central area and occasionally have a little bit of interaction with other players by knocking them over and kind of taking ownership of that terrain tile. Now, what's interesting about the structure of this game is that this game takes place in rounds, but not everybody is going to finish the round at the same time. In fact, it costs resources to move up these tracks, but if you are able to cleverly generate more resources along the way, you are able to elongate your turn, which means that someone may actually complete their turn before you do and move on to a subsequent round of the game. And that's where your player board becomes really interesting. So in your player board, you start with a very minimal level of income because there are all of these little income buildings that are covering up additional income that you need to reveal before you're able to generate it. And so a lot of the tracks not only give you these actions on the board, but also allow you to lift off these income buildings so that every new round of the game, you'll be able to generate more stuff to get things done. The other thing about these tracks is that it's a bit of a race, because if you are able to race up these tracks and be the first person to land in each new section of each of these tracks, you're going to collect these beautiful structural buildings. And what do you do with them? They go on a polyomino side game that is in your player area. And you are trying to complete this grid as well as possible with these different polyomino shaped buildings. Also, the income buildings that I mentioned that you will be removing to allow you to generate more income, they will also be going onto this board. And this board is going to help you get victory points for the number of rows and columns that you're able to complete on this board throughout the game, as well as generate some bonus resources when you're able to complete a 3x3 grid. Now, I've kind of buried the lead here because this is a civ building game and you start the game with an asymmetric civ that is going to give you some ongoing benefit or an action that you can take or a particular strategy that you need to follow in order to really maximize the value of that civilization. And the final piece of the puzzle are the Tapestry cards. So there are technically 5 rounds in this game, and in 3 of those rounds, you're going to be able to play a Tapestry card. These Tapestry cards guide the way that that round is going to play out for you. So it might give you a special ability for that round, or it might just give you a lot of victory points. So to summarize, in this game, you're really trying to get along these tracks as much as possible to get these better actions, but to do so, you're going to need more and more resources. And so resources become really your life source in this game, and you need to be generating as many of them as possible. They're all tracked on your player board. As soon as you're out of resources or you decide that there's no other action you want to take, you need to go through an income process, which is going to happen at different times to different players in the game, which means that some players might have to sit out the last part of the game because they would have exhausted all of their turns, and they may need to wait a while if they haven't elongated their turns enough for the other players to finish their game. At the end of the game, when everybody is finished, it will be the player with the most victory points that wins. So the way that we wanted to talk about our review of this game is really to walk you through our experience. We have played so much Tapestry, and our experience with the game really changed over time. So starting with the initial experience, we found it, well, in my experience, I found it underwhelming.
Yeah, again, it's one of those games, obviously we love Stonemaier games in general, and it's one of those games that I'd heard a lot about, I'd sort of seen it around. I know, a couple of people that really, really love this game, people that I admire, and then when we played it, it's like, it was really easy to understand. But yeah, it was this sort of like, is that all?
Yeah.
Like,
it's similar, like we were like, is that it?
Yeah.
Is that
it's
it?
Like, what am I missing?
Yeah, and because we play like quite complex games where there's lots of moving parts, because on your turn all you're doing is moving along one of these tracks.
Pay a resource, move, or pay a couple of resources based on that and move and get a benefit.
Exactly. Yeah. The teacher's really simple, but when we started playing it out, we were like, well, this, like, what are we missing? Like, the overwhelming sense of this game was like, nothing felt particularly powerful. And it's like, how could you possibly get anything done in this game? And that's what led us to the one line in the rulebook that drove us mad, which was one little offhanded comment by Jamie saying, a great score is 300. And that is what made us play this game until we could get close to 300. But when we read that, we were like, what?
Because that first game, we didn't even crack 100.
We were like, how could you possibly move just one cube and get one little benefit and get anywhere near 300? And why is there a 400 marker on the board? Like, why are people getting 400?
Why are you taunting us?
What is happening? And so that one line in the rule book really made us invest further to understand this game. And so what happened after that is that we just continued to play more and more and more. And this game, the experience of this game really changed for me personally. I felt that at the beginning, the strategy was so unclear. I couldn't possibly see how this game could come together to create a high score. The more we played it, the more you realize the importance of elongating your turn and the sequence of things. So the way that you do things and the order that you take is so incredibly important in this game, because if you need to make a small move over here to generate one more resource, which is going to allow you to do a powerful move over there, you need to be thinking through the sequence of your steps.
I think to me, it's a game that is entirely about optimizing synergies. And as you said, that timing of when things kind of happen and kind of go and get myself to this point so that when I take that action, it's really going to pay off over here. That is something that does not come across at all on your first game, nor should you. I think this is one of those warnings if you're teaching this to other players. Don't go into those levels too early, because again, like, you're kind of, the first time around, you're getting to learn the tracks and go, oh, you know, there's that benefit of, I remember the first time around I was like, oh, I love the fact that I can go through the science track and just roll the dice and it'll help me move somewhere else. But then it's like, well, no, those first few rolls, you're not going to get the benefit of those other tracks, and sometimes that next benefit is going to be really, really good, so you're much better off using resources to get that. So again, it's that, those are things that the layers sort of peel off with more experience of the game.
And what I actually really enjoyed about this game is our skill level, like the progression in this game was completely linear. I actually felt the more I played it, the better I became and the higher my score. And that started at 100, and then it was 150, and then it was 200, and then it was 250. And for that reason, as you move up, I feel as though an experienced gamer or an experienced person with Tapestry
of
this particular game is always going to beat an inexperienced player.
Yeah, there's a reliable increase in your level of skill as you get better at this, to the point where it doesn't really matter what combination of things you get.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's what I wanted to talk about, is that one of the biggest criticisms of this game is about balance and randomness. And there are a couple of elements to this game that when you first play it, there are things that feel really overpowered and there are things that feel really random. And the two things that come to mind are, first of all, civs. So the civs are
the unique civilization.
The unique civilization or the asymmetric ability or strategy that you need to follow to get some bonus resources, victory points, whatever the case may be. It kind of does dictate your strategy. And along the way, Jamie at Stonemaier Games has been very good at collecting data about whichever one of your civs that you start with, how likely are you to win? And so along the way has provided information about how to, I guess,
like modify or adjust your starting conditions to bring a bit more balance.
To bring more balance to the civs. So a lot of people have really focused on the civs being an unbalanced component of the game. The other thing is, like, just like if you've ever played Viticulture, it relies somewhat on those visitor cards. There are Tapestry cards. Now, some of these Tapestry cards are incredibly powerful and others are really useless.
Yeah.
And you don't get that many of them. It's actually really hard to come by Tapestry cards, and you are going to get the opportunity to play one at the start of each new round. And some people feel that that is too random and that, you know, you might just happen to get a Tapestry card that's really powerful or happens to work in nicely with your unique ability. And that is too overpowered. But my thinking about this is quite interesting, because at the beginning of the game or at the beginning of when we first started playing this game, I too felt that. I felt as though someone was doing something with a really, like,
you see someone play something, you're like,
like, how is that? How is that fair? How come you get to do that? How come you're building every one of these, like, buildings and doing all these amazing things, and then you draw a really crappy, like, Tapestry card, and it's so underwhelming. Like, you're just like, this is, like, of no use to me, and I have no other card to play. But what happened was, as we got better at the core game, so as we got better at the things that weren't changing between players, what became really evident is that these things, to me, are the icing on the cake. They're the difference between getting a score of 250 instead of 200, not the difference between getting 100 and 250. I didn't feel as though that was the case, and I feel like they're going to be more impactful with players who are all inexperienced. So the person who gets the best civ is probably going to win. Or for players who are incredibly experienced and all know how to leverage the base game to then use their asymmetric ability to kind of get one up on the other players. But for the most part, I feel like
there's a core skill.
There's a real core skill.
And I feel like regardless of all the periphery.
Now, to test this theory out, what we did was quite interesting. We had the players around the table pick the worst possible combinations of things for me. So I was left with what was perceived to be the least powerful, worst civ, as well as a terrible starting Tapestry card and a terrible map that would not work well with my civilization. And so I had the worst possible combination of things, and I won that game.
Yeah, and even during that game, there was someone who had a civilization that were like, that seems very overpowered.
Yes.
And they still, it still wasn't the thing that allowed them to
Because
win. Yeah.
I think that there's something with these, even when as your civ feels overpowered, it can also be distracting because there are things you can get done on the board that require your focus to be on the board, whereas sometimes for your civ, you need to feed it resources or you need to kind of do something else that's like, it's slowing down your progress in other areas.
Yeah.
And so that was an interesting experience. I do think that, of course, the asymmetric powers and the tapestry cards do have some impact and people need to be aware of that. But I didn't think it was as hugely impactful in a mixed group of players as what it's been made out to be.
And so the ultimate question is, did we actually like the game? Did we enjoy the game? We said that our first experience with our first game was a bit like, wait, what? And then subsequent games was all about, wait, what do you mean you can get a 300 score, let alone a 400 score? And so that kind of exploration. I found that every time I would go, like, sit down to play this, I was never dreading it. It was never like, oh, here we go again. But also, you know, as I would finish the game, I'd be like, yeah, okay, that was interesting. Like, and I think overall my experience of this game is that it's, for me, it's an intellectually interesting combination of things and like, oh yeah, how do you get better at that? But at no point do I get I never feel thematically or emotionally invested in it. And there's been a lot of self-reflection as to, well, why is that? It's like, I have an intellectual relationship with this, but not a heart relationship with it. And so for me, I know that I'm high on immersion, like thematic immersion, which I never, even though there's a lot of components here that make sense. So like the military track is all about, you know, things like conquering and taking over territory. The science track, probably that's the one that makes the least sense because it's more about like kind of tapestries. The exploration is what allows you to, but at no point do I feel like I'm actually building my civilization. I start with, you start with your, you know, make fire and your unique power. But even as I'm laying down the tapestries, the cards are so random that it's like you could end up having like a space type card before democracy happens. So it's like there isn't really, I never got a sense of that progression. The other thing with the actual building of the land, of putting those landmarks, and that also kind of felt like, I love polyomino type puzzles. This felt so difficult to actually get happening in a satisfying way. And then even when you manage to get it going, it never felt like the emotional satisfying payoff was enough.
I agree.
For the effort.
The polyomino tile part of this game is my least favorite part of this game. I enjoy placing them and trying to make it work, but it never has the payoff of victory points that I want it to. Even like you can get to a point where there is kind of a reoccurring thing throughout the game that triggers that to score, but it feels like it takes so long to build up that it's a hard engine to get going. And so the focus on that is kind of less for me. I agree that I agree that this game is not very thematic. I mean, it's like all the things are labeled correctly, but there's no sense of...
And like the tapestries make sense, the card themselves make sense, the technologies make sense, but I never actually... It's like that next step. It's like kind of makes intellectual sense, but I never actually felt like, oh, I'm living these things out and it's sort of unfolding in that way.
I really enjoy the componentry, though. Yeah. These buildings could just be flat polyomino tiles and it wouldn't matter too much to me, but I enjoy the fact that it creates table presence.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
When people see those, they're like, what is this game? And that's exciting that I get to build this. And there is a sense of like, ooh, I get like a lighthouse. Yeah. And it's like, it's kind of fun. What I hate about those is that their footprint does not match the...
Why? That could be so much easier. Like, just if it's something that's going to take four squares, make it four
squares on the base.
The other thing is the color coding. Why wouldn't you color code the base that you know that, you know, all the reds have the red, you know, base with them, all the yellows have the yellow, because otherwise putting it to every time
super frustrating.
We've played a lot of this.
We've played so much
every time it's like, wait, which one goes here? Is this the right building? Is it? There's no need for that.
There is no, that is a really frustrating part of the aesthetics of this game.
It's such a simple thing.
But something that they got really right, I think, is the iconography in this game. Yeah. And there's something so beautiful about the simplicity of the teach. So that is one thing that I really like about this game is I like to bring new players into more complex games. And this one has a heavy Euro feel without the overhead of a huge 1 hour long teach. It's just within like 5 minutes, people can be up and going with this game, which is super rare, especially for a game that can play out over 2 hours and feel like this really big experience. Like I really love that about this game.
Yeah. The other thing that I find interesting is that so many times you have this tension of the decision between, do I cash in some points now or do I get some resources, essentially gambling that those resources are going to allow me to do more so that I can get a better benefit victory point wise later on. One example is the combat dice, where when you roll them, when you're kind of conquering a territory, you will often have the balance or the choice of, do you want to cash in some victory points or get a resource. And so often it's that thing of like, well, earlier on the resource is actually going to be more valuable. Later down the track, if depending on how far away the game is, it's like, well, no, the victory point. But that happens multiple times throughout the game. I also never felt like, even when that happens, it's like it always feels like the choices that you get are like, yeah, okay. Like it's never like this is amazing. And this was something that happened consistently whenever we had to correct or verify a rule. I feel like this game is always kind of keeping you, like your hands are just like tied to a degree, or you're like, oh yeah, I can't, but then it's like, and it's like that whenever we were clarifying a rule, the clarification was usually erring on the side of, this is less satisfying that you thought this action was going to be.
The least powerful part of it. If anything in this game is too powerful, you're probably playing it wrong. But interestingly, I wish that some things were a little bit more powerful towards the end of the tracks, because it's really hard to get to the end of a track. And the payoff is like, okay. But I think the payoff for me in this game has nothing to do with what I'm getting in each turn, and really it's all to do with the score. And it's really interesting because that's unlike anything else in my collection or in our collection. I feel like I don't usually focus on my actual specific score. For me, this is like playing a multiplayer game of Gashon Clever, because what you're trying to do is combo your way through to a high score, and there's not a lot of interaction with other players around the table. And so as much as I enjoy this game, I would never say no to a game of this.
Agree.
When I sit down, I'm really looking forward to like how it's going to play out and how I'm going to combo myself to a high score. But in terms of my gaming preferences, I like a high degree of interaction. I like games where Maggie can take a spot that I needed and it be so devastating to my strategy. Just like, please don't take that spot, and you take it, and I'm just like, now I've got to rethink everything. That doesn't happen in this game. And because that doesn't happen in this game, I don't need to second guess what people are going to be doing next around the table. There's a tiny element of that in some of the race components of this. So if you're the first person to move into a new section, you'll get one of these glorious buildings. But it's it doesn't really matter so much. I can still get the main action that I wanted to do done, irregardless of what other people do. Interestingly, a lot of people talk about the combat in this game. The middle of the board is where all the players come together to interact, but it's not really, just like Scythe. The combat is really downplayed in this game. You can only move into someone's space if there's only one building there. And if you move in and conquer them, they topple over. Now you own that space for scoring conditions, but now no one else can move into that space. So it's a very limited amount of combat. Actually playing into the center of the board is more about the resources and the victory points you can get by having greater ownership, and not really about the combat. Will it ever become one of my favorite games? Probably not. But do I appreciate it for what it is? And also, I just saw so many people. We played with many different types of people, different thinkers, and people really enjoyed it. Like I got so much enjoyment out of how easy it was for people to understand what they needed to do. And then how, at the end of the game, they were like, I got 110. What? You can, and then we'd say, a great score is 300. And just the same degree of let's go again because I want to get there. It's just such a cool goal.
I think I want to very quickly talk about the aesthetic of it, because I enjoy elements of it, but I think that's also part of what makes me not love the game and not kind of fall in love with it. I think the aesthetic is fine. I love the buildings, but I never, again, it's sort of, the iconography is great for the sake of playing, but it's not very evocative. Like, I guess the only times where I feel like I get a little breath of fresh air is when I have a tapestry card that has some kind of little illustration, and I'm like, oh, thank God, here's something that I can kind of hang on to. So I think, overall, that's my experience of this, is that it's a kind of mental, interesting, figuring out the synergies puzzle, but my soul is never invested in it.
I think if you're a themer or someone who cares deeply about that level of immersion, this is not that game. This game to me is ultimately a bit of a cube pusher. It's all about the tracks mostly, and really it's multiplayer solitaire at the heart of it. And so it's kind of like you need to be aware of those things. I can see this game being actually quite polarizing.
Absolutely.
And also I think it depends on your experience with the game. As we said, we did not enjoy this game when we first started playing it. We were like, what is the hype about this game all about? Like, I don't understand. And it was that goal to get to a higher score that made us peel back the layers of the game, made us realize that actually there is a strategy and a process, and once you become familiar with that, it is really satisfying.
I feel like still when something is really it's not like a thematic immersion type experience for me, the puzzle will be the thing that keeps me engaged and keeps me going. And I think the reason this puzzle doesn't engage me as much as other puzzles that even abstract from abstract games is, again, that sense, like, I feel like as I'm playing, I've got a chain to each one of my hands, and every time I want to go and do something powerful, it's like, no, you can only go to here, and you can only do, and so it's like, I want to do all these amazing things, but I end up just having to like play this game, just like, almost just like trying to make fire.
A game of tiny steps. It really is.
And so, I constantly feel like my sense of freedom is impinged on. And then when I do finally get to have a win, it's like it's instead of like a yes.
I also want to talk about the game at different player counts. So we did play at a whole range of player counts. My least favorite is actually at 2. I feel as though the multiplayer solitaire elements of this game just get completely amplified in a 2-player game, because it almost got to the point where, as experienced players of this game, we were almost playing simultaneously because there was just no reason to pay attention to what each other were doing, aside from in the places where we were racing. Everything else was just inconsequential to our turns. And that was a frustrating experience for me as someone who likes interaction.
I did find that I also enjoyed it at a higher player count as well, because when we were playing at a 2-player, I almost couldn't even care what your civ was doing. It's like I completely lost track of that.
Exactly.
Whereas for some reason, when it was, there was 4 of us, it's like, it felt so, I felt much more engaged with everyone else, even though I think it's because there's more things happening on the board or whatever.
There's more races going on. There's more contention for certain scoring elements. But I also agree that at a 3, 4, 5 player count, there's much more engagement and interest in the fact that people are doing completely disparate things. And
it feels alive.
It does feel alive. And you're like, now you're in space. Well, I'm over here doing something completely different. And we're both generating, victory points. And so that becomes the interesting thing, is just seeing how their game is playing out in a completely different way. When it was 2-player, you and I, if we started pursuing a similar strategy, you just didn't get that sense of like, oh, wow, that's interesting what you're doing over there.
And it's not broken at 2. Like, you can play at 2. It's just a very different experience. It's
but
a more mental, heady, multiplayer solitaire
I would never
experience.
get this game out just to play with you, though.
I agree.
I think, but if it's like a bigger group, and especially a group of mixed level gamers, I think this game, really shines. We also played it with you played it solo, but we also played it 2 players with the
Shadow Empire.
And I just talk quickly about the 2-player version of that. It didn't improve things for me. In fact, it made them worse.
Annoying.
It is really annoying.
Just gets in the way, which is its intention, is to get in the way and steal some landmarks, so it gives you fewer options. Or it's supposed to make the race to get those landmarks a little bit more tense. But if anything, it just felt disruptive.
It felt really disruptive because in this game, if you play it frequently, it's really fast. All you're doing is making one move and taking that action. So what happens is, I would make my turn really quickly, Maggie makes her turn really quickly, and now we have to
It's like, oh, let's do the cards and so they
shadow.
move over here and nothing happens.
And then it's like, and then I go really quick, Meg goes really quick, and then it's like,
oh wait,
what's
the cards.
Shadow Empire doing?
Yeah. So it did feel like a clunky added extra step that didn't necessarily make the game feel like...
Not really, because
better.
the main thing that it's doing is taking the buildings before you can get to them.
And stealing the end of track, reaching the end of track.
And that's the two main things. Bonus. And really, like, for me, the buildings are kind of like a lower, like, for my personal strategy in this game, lesser to my strategy.
Yeah. So talk about the solo?
Yeah.
All right, so the solo has an Automa, and with the Automa, you're essentially playing with two Automas because you're playing with the Shadow Empire, which is the one that we just described, which essentially is just moving along different tracks, stealing landmarks. And then the Automa itself is, again, moving. It's the same kind of set of, like a pair of cards that then dictates which track this Automa is going to be moving on. But the main Automa does take some action. So it might actually, like, it'll interact with you, it'll lay down tiles, and it'll try and do combat and things like that. So it gives you that an option to have that element of the game. It'll help refresh the technologies, steal some of the Tapestry cards, which again, like, because you can't really see them, I don't necessarily know what's being stolen, so it's not really that big of a deal. For me, the experience of that was interesting because I don't usually enjoy. My expectation was like, great, like now I get to just play and figure out my strategy and get better at those synergies, because it's all about getting to know those synergies and how do you make the most, even when luck may not be on your side. And there are a lot of different luck elements, because there's also like the tiles. You don't know what kind of tile you're going to get and what benefit you're going to get. You're rolling dice for a few things. You get in the tapestry. The problem I found is that because you're moving not one but two different kind of automas in a way, or tracks, I found it very disruptive to my mental flow. So as I was kind of going, okay, well, I want to do this and this. Oh, okay, now it's the automa's turn. I get completely distracted. And then by the time I kind of facilitate it, even though it's not a difficult facilitation, because you're kind of doing, okay, revealing those cards, but then you're moving two different things and then deciding, like, there's a hierarchy of choice. Sometimes it's like, well, they'll move to whichever one's closest to a landmark or whichever one's closest. And that pause that I have to do of like, okay, I need to now assess which one is technically closest to this or that, or if that's not the condition, which in the hierarchy is that was enough to just break the flow for me. And so what happened is, inevitably every time I would play this game, I actually have a lesser experience of it, and I get a worse score. So you have the Automa has its own player board, and then every turn it scores. So every era, as it's sort of going through the eras, it scores incrementally points for its advancement, for the landmarks that it gets, and for its advancements in different tracks. And I just always found it, like, usually at the start, the first few eras, it's actually pretty spot on. Like, we're kind of head to head. This is in the basic levels. I've never been able to go anywhere near beyond like level 2 of difficulty. But then towards the end, it sort of ramps up, and I just found it more distracting than fun. So I definitely, this is not a game that I would play solo, not because it's bad. And I know plenty of people that love this as a solo game, just because I personally find it very distracting when I'm having to facilitate that turn. And then by the time I get back to my own thing, I have no idea what it was that I was trying to get to.
So that is our really long-winded review of Tapestry. There was a lot to talk about because our review really did change over time the more we played this game. Yep. If you would like to know more about the expansions, we've also played a lot of plans, employees, and arts and architecture. We will link to those individual videos in the description below. But otherwise, if you enjoyed this review, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll be back with more board game reviews soon. But bye for now.
Bye.